Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman, and welcome to my watercolor tutorial, Eggs in a Teacup. This painting is based on a photograph that I found on pixabay.com. Pixabay.com is a great resource for artists. Most photographs on Pixabay are both copyright-free and attribution-free. This beautiful photograph was taken by Terry Canetti. Let's start off by looking at the supplies I used. I typically paint on Arches cold press paper, but when I do ink and watercolor pieces, I prefer the smoothness of hot press paper. My sheet is 140 pounds, trimmed to 8 by 12. I used a 2H pencil to trace my initial drawing. Then I went over my pencil drawing with a waterproof black ink pen. I used a micron pen, .05. For my watercolor brushes, I used a black gold 311, which is a round brush, size 00. A smaller round, I used Princeton Heritage 4050R, size 6. And for the smallest strokes, I used a miniature brush. Of course, you'll need water and a water container and paper towels. I tend to use old t-shirts that I've cut up instead of paper towels. I find that the softness of the old t-shirts is very gentle on my brushes. All my watercolor paints are Daniel Smith. I used sap green, green gold, manganese blue hue, quinacridone purple, lavender, quinacridone gold, Aussie red gold, burnt sienna, indigo, and new gamboge. You don't have to use these colors or anything even similar to them. Color choice is one of the most personal decisions we make in our artwork. So please feel free to use whatever colors appeal to you. To transfer your drawing onto your watercolor paper, there are several different processes you can use. I like to use a light table, and I trace in pencil. That allows me to erase and adjust after I'm done tracing. Once I'm happy with my drawing, I go over it with an ink pen. I give the ink a few minutes to totally dry and evaporate, and then I go in with a kneaded eraser and erase out all my pencil lines. I end up with a clean ink drawing ready for painting. And finally, it's time to start. I pick up my largest round brush and I want to paint in with manganese blue hue both the shadows I see on the white portions of the teacup and saucer that are in shadow, and this is also the color I'll use for my eggs. I like that manganese blue hue is a slight granulating color, and it will add a nice speckled texture to the eggs. I start off by painting the shadow side of the teacup and saucer so that that paint has a chance to dry while I'm painting the eggs. And you can see just how watery my mixture is. I really like using a watered down manganese blue hue to paint shadows on white objects. I'm painting this in a pretty loose style, so I'm not particularly concerned about staying within the ink lines. With such a precise drawing, it really allows me to be pretty loose with my application of paint, and the drawing will still hold it all together. Try to paint very watery and loosely. Before I paint the eggs, I clean out my brush, and with just water on my brush, I water in each egg. I try to leave one little corner of it dry so that the paint won't go into that area. That will be the highlighted part of the egg. Starting off with this first egg, you can see that the highlight is on the left-hand edge, and I didn't put any water in there. I'm dropping in paint, and even though it looks very blue now, there's so much water both on the paper and in my mix that I know it'll dilute quite a bit as it dries. I soften the edge where it goes from paint to the white highlight just by running across that edge with a damp brush. I'm going to let that egg dry and I start painting in with, again, just water, the second egg. This time the highlight is on the right hand edge, and you can see where I don't paint water into that edge. And then I come in and just drop in paint. My brush is fairly loaded with watery manganese blue hue, and I just touch it onto the wet paper. That's enough to release the paint from the brush and let it flow smoothly into the egg shape. Again, I rinse out my brush, I dry out that excess water on my towel, and I just run it along the bead of paint between paint and white paper, just to smooth it out. This will give us a gradual transition from color to white highlight instead of a hard edge. While the eggs are still wet, I dropped in just a little bit more darker blue hue on the darkest side of those eggs to make them look more three-dimensional. And then I start painting the middle egg. I didn't wet this one down because I didn't want to encourage the neighboring eggs to blend into it. I'm still using the same watery mix of manganese blue hue. I pick up a little bit of paint if too much is flowing from the areas that I want to be the lightest part of the egg. To do that, I just rinse out my brush, I dry it out on my towel, and I use it sort of as a sponge to pick up the paint off of the eggs where I don't want paint. It's time to let those eggs dry. I picked up my miniature brush and I start painting in the shadow that I see on the teacup handle. I'm still using the watery manganese blue hue. This is a darker shadow than what I painted on the rest of the teacup and the saucer. If you find that it gets too dark while it's still wet, just pick some up with your brush. You can wipe it right off the paper with your brush. If, on the other hand, you find that yours is just too light and as it's drying, it's almost fading to nothing, you can come in and do a second layer. We want to get these shadows in before we start painting those lovely purple flowers on top. I study my reference and I'm just adding little arbitrary shadows that I see in the picture. These are lovely details on the saucer. With those blue shadowy shapes painted in, I turn my attention to the gold detailing on the cup and saucer. I use quinacridone gold and my smallest brush and lightly paint in some of the gold trim I see. Be sure not to paint this in as one solid line. As you study the reference photo, you'll see that this line breaks up and in some areas you don't even see it. In other areas, I see a slight curve and then a break of just white porcelain and then it picks up again. In some areas, it's a darker gold, and I just use thicker paint. And in the areas where that gold becomes much lighter and starts to fade to white, I just water down my quinacridone gold. On this portion of the saucer that is directly in front of the viewer, we really see the thickness of the ceramic saucer. So I'm sure to not paint that whole edge gold, but rather just the sliver of the detailing above it. I work my way around really following the reference photo. It's not necessary to make this gold edge symmetrical on both sides because the light is hitting each side of the saucer differently, and it makes sense that it would appear different to us. The gold edge along the cup is much easier. It is more or less of the same thickness. It does tend to fade out a little bit and get thinner on the edges, so pay attention to that. And there's a lovely gold detail right on top of the handle. I'm sure to leave that spot of white paper as the highlight. While this area is still damp, I drop in some thicker quinacridone gold where it is in fact darker in my reference photo. With just a little bit of water on my brush, I come in and soften some of the gold I laid down earlier, just along the bottom edge. The edge of the saucer is rather scalloped, so I'm not even worried about having to get nice, smooth, even, round lines. It's okay for them to be a little bit bumpy as you work your way around. At this point, all my blue shadow paint is completely dry. You can see that my gold color is not bleeding into it. I pick up new gamboge and paint it into the center of some of those flowers. Not all the centers are yellow. Some of them are the white of the paper, and some are actually a light green. For the light green, I use green gold. Here I'm mixing new gamboge with the green gold for the dots that are a little more muted down in color. As I paint in these centers of the flowers, again, I'm not too concerned about staying inside my ink drawing of that center. With a watery green gold on my brush, I start to paint in some leaf shapes. I'm not being extremely realistic about this. It is more the idea of painting in shapes between the flowers that are suggestive of stems and leaves. I'm using the reference photo as a guide, but I don't feel like I have to stick to it very strictly. And now I've added sap green to the green gold, and you can see that my green shapes are getting darker because of it. I work my way around painting in leaves and the negative spaces between the flowers. Miniature brushes are so small by nature that they don't carry much paint and water, and you'll find that you have to reload it often. However, the shapes we're painting are not very big either, so it's not a tedious thing. Every time I go to reload my brush, I dip into a different section of that mixture. On the right-hand side of that puddle is mostly green gold, and on the left-hand side, it's mostly sap green. And in between them, they've mixed together. So whenever I reload, I just try to go to a different area of that puddle so that my greens have a little variety to them. Sometimes I just go back in with water to soften up the greens I've already painted, or to lighten them up. I find that these shapes look better if they have soft edges. So once I paint them, I run a watery brush along the edges and let them sort of dissolve into the rest of the flowers and teacup details. I'll turn my attention to those lovely flowers. I'm still using the miniature brush. For the dark purple, I'm picking up quinacridone purple. And for the lighter purple, I'm picking up lavender. Lavender is a really pretty color, but it is quite opaque, so I'm sure to add quite a bit of water to it as I paint with it. These mixes are pretty watery. I paint in a few petals or even just a few sections of petals, and then I pick up a darker purple and drop it into that light purple shape I just painted. This lets them bleed together and gives the flowers a lot more interest. Be sure you don't just keep painting them all with the same value and the same color. They'll end up looking like they're construction paper cutouts. We want variety in these purple flowers. Maybe you paint one petal dark purple and the petal next to it a watery purple and let them blend together. I tend to do that even within a petal. I'll give it a dark tip and a lighter center, or vice versa. The yellow centers of the flowers that I painted earlier are completely dry, so they're not blending into each other. If a flower looks boring to me or starts looking flat as it dries, I either add a dark touch of paint to it or a watery touch here and there. Try to make them a little more interesting. I'm even adding some manganese blue hue at this point. That would be for the lightest petals I see. I do refer back to my reference photo for this, just to be sure I don't get mechanical and make all my flowers look alike. Since I have this watery purple on my brush, I decide to come in and re-emphasize that dark shadow on the underside of the handle of the teacup. The flowers on the left-hand side of the saucer are really quite faded compared to the flowers on the right-hand side. So I'm painting with very watered down puddles of blue and purple. As I work my way around to the right-hand side flowers, I'll deepen that color by thickening up my paint. Even though these flowers on the left-hand side are lighter, that doesn't mean I just want to paint them all from the same puddle of paint. Even here, the same rule applies. Let's go for some variety. We can keep it light, but let's have some play between lavender, quinacridone purple, and manganese blue hue. Now that I've painted some of the darker details on the teacup and saucer, I can see that some of my shadows are not quite dark enough. So I come back in again with very watery mix of manganese blue hue and paint a little more shadow in the areas where it needs to be darker. I want to let that area dry, so I start painting flowers that don't really touch up against it. And here you can see these flowers are quite a bit darker than the flowers I painted earlier on the left-hand side. There's a white flower in the middle of all this purple, so I paint purple around it. I never use white paint. Anything that's white in my picture, I leave as the white of the paper, which means just painting around those shapes. As I paint the purple around it, you can really see that white flower starts to pop up. I'm having so much fun painting these flowers. It would be easy to get carried away and end up covering the whole teacup and saucer with these shapes. But one aspect I really like of this photograph is all the white of the cup and the saucer that I see. It gives the image a real air of lightness. So I want to be sure to stop before I overdo it. And to keep the flowers from looking too packed together and just turning into a big purple blob or a big green blob of leaves, try to leave little white specks of paper even between the flowers and leaves. That will keep that air of lightness to them. Watercolorists are always looking for reasons to preserve the white of the paper. In other words, we're looking for highlights and shapes that we can leave as white. That white in a painting gives it a nice transparency and airiness to it. And it goes well with the transparency of the watercolor paints themselves. Now that those flowers are painted, on a few of them I come in and restate the yellow centers. New gamboge can be painted on pretty thickly and it'll show up nicely. Now I pick up some Aussie red gold, still working with my miniature brush, and I add a touch of burnt sienna to it. I'm using this mix to paint in some detailing on the gold. That gold has a slightly dark rim to it. So as I paint this in, I'm sure to leave some of the original quinacridone gold to show through. And this will show up as a shadow in the gold detailing. It's not everywhere, so don't be mechanical and just paint it in everywhere. Really look at your reference photo and try to pick out where there are darker gold accents up against that lighter gold. It's time to paint the nest. And since it's drawn in so much detail, I can really paint it with broad brush strokes. I put down my miniature brush and I pick up my larger round brush. You can paint the nest any color you want. I'm trying to keep it somewhat neutral looking. But the important thing is that the interior part of it, where the eggs are nested, end up being painted darker. So they actually look like they're nested inside, down deep into the nest. I start by mixing some quinacridone gold into the yellow mixes I already had on my palette, which really was just a touch of new gamboge and quinacridone gold, burnt sienna, Aussie red gold. Basically, it's just a mix of all those yellows and oranges I mixed earlier. And it is pretty watery at this point. To make that nest look three-dimensional, we want to be sure we leave some of it light in color and some of it much darker. To start darkening the areas of the nest, I add burnt sienna. I'm adding it in while that yellow mixture is still damp, so that there will be a soft transition between my darker areas and the lighter areas of the nest. I paint carefully around the eggs. I want to be sure I keep their crisp, round shape. Other than being careful around the eggs, I paint pretty quickly, not worried about each individual strand of straw that makes up the nest. I add more quinacridone gold, You can really play a lot with the colors you use in the nest and not be so concerned about what I'm using. Consider more the values you see in the photograph. Where is it lightest? Where is it darkest? To paint those pieces of twigs and straw that are coming out of the nest and have a sort of flyaway look, I will use my miniature brush. I don't want to paint those with a large brush and end up having them get too thick. However, even though I will use my miniature brush, I'm not particularly concerned about staying within each individual ink line. I like painting these somewhat loosely. And just like the interior of the nest, for these pieces I will also paint some of them with that lighter yellowy mix. Some of them will be a little bit darker with burnt sienna. And later, when I add indigo, some of them will get really dark. Indigo is a really powerful color, so I add very little of it. It can quickly take over a mix. I just want to be sure that I make the interior where the eggs are touching up against the nest dark enough to create a sense of 3 dimensions. I do slow down and take my time with these little flyaway shapes. With those shapes in place, I pick up my large round brush again and do another layer on my nest. Don't try to do the nest with your small miniature brush. It'll just start showing up with a lot of different brush strokes that may not please you. I added a touch of sap green to start getting the darker shapes where I need them in the nest. The green works well for nests, especially up against the browns and yellows I've already painted. I just barely touched my brush into indigo, and I'm starting to paint some of the darker shapes I see. The paint on the nest is fairly wet now, and I feel like I can push and pull it pretty easily. With the damp brush, I'm picking up some of the paint from the lighter areas of the nest. I'm drying it off on my towel and then cleaning my brush out again. Now I'm really getting the indigo going, and I usually save that for the very end. I add whatever purple was still left over on my palette to that indigo. It's not necessary, but I had it in my palette, so why not? And I'm really darkening up the darkest shapes I see in the nest. Again, my paint is pretty damp on there. So as I lay down these dark shapes, they have very soft edges. They'll diffuse into the damp paint. If, on the other hand, your nest is dry at this point, you can go ahead and soften it by just using a damp brush along the edge. That'll help it smoothly transition into the rest of the nest and not have a lot of hard edges. I noticed that there are a few strands of twigs or straw that cross in front of my eggs. So I pick up my miniature brush and some fairly thick burnt sienna so that I can paint these in with some precision. As soon as I get these little pieces of straw painted in, it definitely helps to make the eggs look like they are nestled inside the teacup. Gives it a nice, cozy, and three-dimensional look. I decide I need to lighten up some of the areas of my nest, and with a slightly damp brush, I come in and lift out paint just in a few areas. All that remains to be painted is a slight shadow underneath the saucer. I start off by just using water very carefully up against the edge of the saucer, and then I bring the water out in the general shape of that shadow. By putting in water, it ensures that when I drop in the paint, it'll have a soft, diffused look and not a hard edge. I find that putting in a hard edge on shadows makes them look more like another object instead of a shadow. With very watery quinacridone purple, I come in and paint the general shape of that shadow. Don't overpaint it or overwork it. I find that purple and blue is a nice shadow color. And I decide to add just a few touches of quinacridone gold into that purple to make it a little more interesting. I soften the very edges with a damp brush, and I'm done. Here's the painting after it has completely dried. Thank you for joining me for painting eggs in a teacup. I hope you enjoyed this watercolor tutorial. Thank you.